alliances with the regional countries. CPEC is served with a natural deep sea port, Gwadar, that confers tremendous commercial advantages for trade and commerce. The port, because of its strategic location and natural deep sea configuration, is capable of acting as a regional transshipment hub, as well as a strategic outlet to the landlocked neighbors. The planned special economic zones and a supporting road network offers several trade and commerce potentialities to neighboring countries, especially Afghanistan. A large volume of Afghani trade transit that is presently dependent on Karachi port can be diverted to Gwadar through a network of roads through Chaman-Kandahar Road. The Afghan peace process that has recently gained traction after ceaseless diplomatic efforts by Pakistan, regional countries, and international community is likely to yield long-lasting peace dividends that could ideally be grasped by Afghanistan and Pakistan in a mutually symbiotic trade and commerce partnership with China-Pakistan Economic Corridor acting as a backbone of that partnership. Since CPEC is one of the strands of a larger infrastructure and economic initiative that is Belt and Road Initiative, the geopolitical orientation of the realpolitik in the world appears to be making a slow yet sure transition towards geoeconomics, ushering in a Kantian era in a hitherto Hobbesian world. We are lucky today to have few speakers from the United States and Afghanistan who could offer their honest perspectives on CPEC, BRI, and their potential for Afghanistan. We look forward to a very engaging discussion on today's topic. What do you mind?
Thank you so much, sir. I would now like to call the keynote address speaker, Ms. Tehmina Janjua, to please take the floor. Over to you.
Thank you, Marvin, and thank you to all the panelists. I would like to thank IFRI for inviting me to this important webinar addressing issues of regional connectivity with regard to CPEC and Afghanistan. In essence, CPEC, the flagship project of President Yi's Belt and Road Initiative, is a regional connectivity project. As of yet, its focus has been on enhancing connectivity between Pakistan and China. But it is also envisaged that this connectivity may be extended more broadly to other regional countries, especially Afghanistan and the Central Asian countries. Some initial proposals have already been put forward to realize the broader connectivity goals. These include road and rail linkages between Gwadar and Kandahar, and between Torkham and Kabul. Ideas also exist for possible communications access through the Wakhan corridor so as to link Afghanistan, China, and Pakistan with the Central Asian republics. However, at present, the discussions on broader connectivity for some form of CPEC plus extending to Afghanistan are in a preliminary stage. The scope, nature, and modalities of CPEC projects that may include Afghanistan are yet to be fleshed out. My intention today is not to delve into the specificities of possible projects, which I was hoping General Weinbaum would be able to talk about, and I look forward to listening to him when he comes. Rather, I will address three broad issues. First, the desirability and rationale of an extended CPEC. Second, the challenges that an extension may encounter. And third, the general approach that may be taken in regard to overcoming some of these challenges. The case for an extended CPEC and deep connectivity within the region is rooted in history. Central Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and China have historically been part of a common cultural and economic space. Traders, scholars, and skilled craftsmen have traveled freely in these lands along the fabled Silk Road. The intense commercial and cultural interactions between our peoples led to high levels of prosperity, intellectual and cultural advancement. The colonial intrusion by the British and by Tsarist Russia disrupted this common economic and cultural space, I believe. This space needs to be reestablished. To do so, our existing boundaries should be zones of contact and free communications, and not of strict separation. Free movement of people, goods, services, and ideas, an integral part of President Lee's BRI vision between the countries of the region, could spark a rebirth of the remarkable enlightenment that our larger neighborhood witnessed in the past. Then, prosperous trading economies supported high culture and learning. The conditions for a similar, even richer period of enlightenment can be recreated through the deepening of connectivity in the region. This larger vision is not utopian in any sense, as many would question, because obviously considering what is the situation in Afghanistan, it may sound utopian. I believe it is firmly rooted in the particular geography and the shared history of the region. And with CPEC and BRI, we now have the means for realizing this grand vision. But what can be the challenges in realizing the vision, specifically in the way of extending CPEC to Afghanistan? Policymakers in Afghanistan, China, and Pakistan have indicated their interest in moving forward on deeper connectivity in the region. The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman stated a few weeks ago that China supports the extension of CPEC to Afghanistan, which will bring more BRI benefits to the Afghan people, something we all look forward to. China is also interested in seeing the Gawada port, among other CPEC projects, plays a positive role in this process and stands ready to work together with Pakistan and Afghanistan in this regard. As you know, the Gawada port has now begun to be used for transit trade to Afghanistan. Also, at the conclusion of their tripartite meetings, the three countries, China, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, expressed their desire to deepen connectivity in the region. However, there do exist a number of challenges in operationalizing an extended CPEC. One, there is the geopolitical challenge. There are influential elements within the United States, and we may have some today, that view the BRI and CPEC from a myopic US-China rivalry perspective. Some couch their objections to BRI and CPEC in economic terms. Others, especially within the security establishment, contend that these initiatives have negative strategic implications for the US. This view, if it gains ground in Washington, would act as an impediment to an extended CPEC. I would argue that an extended CPEC would be in the interest of the US as well, if Afghanistan is to be stabilized, and if it is to be assured that there are no spaces open for extremists or terrorists, then ensuring sustained economic development of Afghanistan is vital. And this is something which an extended CPEC can significantly contribute to. Economic development that would result from an extended CPEC would appreciably decrease poverty, unemployment, crime, and drug trafficking. In doing so, it would decrease the pool of potential recruits for extremist groups. Secondly, there is the security challenge. For the implementation and the long-term viability of projects, there must be peace and a degree of stability in Afghanistan. For this, the success of the Afghan peace process is essential. There is room for guarded optimism, but a successful outcome of the peace process is not assured. All stakeholders will have to play their part in advancing the process and in blocking the spoilers. An important element will be the continued commitment of the United States to the peace process, even if there is a change in the administration in Washington. Thirdly, there are operational challenges. CPEC at one level is a commercial model. There is need to formulate and implement projects that are sustainable and have long-term viability. And in an extended CPEC, the projects must be relevant to Afghanistan's specific requirements. They must also take into account the economic constraints of the country and its capacity to the financing of particular activities. CPEC plus projects would need to be customized for Afghanistan. Fourthly, There is the challenge of inclusivity. Conditions should systematically be created to attract investors from a broad range of countries. Both China and Pakistan have reportedly underlined that CPEC projects are open for all investors. CPEC projects, including those that may be envisaged for Afghanistan, can yield highly attractive returns for international investors. In a world flush with capital, but with limited opportunities for profitable investments, this becomes an important selling point, and it needs to be effectively projected. A wider range of investors in extended CPEC projects would not only ensure the long-term viability of those projects, but it would also address the largely misplaced notion that BRI, CPEC only serve the commercial interests of one or two countries. Finally, there's the challenge of the modalities for an extended CPEC. These may range from substantive issues of the content and the nature of specific projects and the business model on which they are based. In addition, an effective organizational framework within which the projects are formulated and implemented would need to be established. To sum up, we need a shared vision of why we should be embarking on an ambitious project of connectivity in the region, including through an extended CPEC. There are strong historical grounds for developing connectivity, as I said before, in the region, and for creating common economic and cultural space that once existed and that resulted in unprecedented levels of prosperity and cultural advancement for the peoples of the region. There do exist many challenges in realizing this vision, but these are not insurmountable. Indeed, given the undoubted benefits of broader and deeper connectivity for the people of the region, these challenges need to be squarely addressed and overcome. And of course, we look forward to the peace process that is in its initiation phase. And that is obviously holds for us the promise of something that can bring together a region that we had in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the keynote address. We will now move on to our presentations. Dr. Soherwordi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I hope I am audible. Yes?
Yes, sir, you are.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you. Thanks to EPRI, Brigadier Staff, for inviting me to present my comments over such a very important and innovative, I must say, topic that you people have brought about. Because right now, the solution of Afghanistan is on cost. I was just speaking with an international news agency, and I was telling them that try not to expect a lot very soon from Doha peace process, because everybody is so pitched to it and is talking about probably tomorrow or day after tomorrow a peace agreement will take place between the Afghan factions. That is not that easy. It has taken 2 years between Taliban and the US, and it is going to take a lot of time between the Afghan factions. However, the question is that right now it is in the process, and in the circumstances, if we are talking about CPEC and its extension to Afghanistan, in fact, it is quite apt and suitable time to bring those subjects into discussion. We see that this Belt and Road Initiative is a huge project, and it's another name basically of New Silk Road. New Silk Road, of course, Afghanistan was part and parcel of it in the past. We also say that CPEC is a mega regional connectivity project that aims to benefit regional economies. Now, in regional economies, of course, Afghanistan is also there. Remember, it's a wonderful theory that we speak about when we talk about war and peace phenomena. Wherever there has been economic interdependence, there has always always been compromises, peace, prosperity, and no to violence and no to war. Everybody knows that economic prosperity is a negation to wars and violence. In our part of the world, we see that no such economic forum has taken place where all regional countries are part and parcel of it, or they are members of it. We have SARC, we have ECO kind of organizations, but they are not working that in terms of the process. They are not working that practically. However, contrary to that, we have ASEAN, we have European Union, where regional countries are parts of these bodies and they are interdependent. So every country's loss is the loss of other parties to these agreements or these organizations. In our part of the world, no such interdependence has taken place. The point that I'm trying to make here is that if ECU has not worked yet, if SARC has not worked yet, we anticipate that probably it would be CPEC, which will cluster few countries in this region because their economic determinants will be more or less identical. In our region, when we say that it is absent, economic interdependence is absent, it produces more suspicions and apprehensions, which leads to war. We have a glaring example of Afghanistan. We have a glaring example of animosity between Pakistan and India. Now, in the current circumstances, in current regional order, with respect to Afghanistan, things are two-pronged. One is, as I mentioned, Doha peace talks, intra-Afghan dialogue is in process, and the other is economic prosperity is needed for this entire region. We have a very shabby industrial structure of almost all the countries in the region. Poverty is rampant, backwardness is there. So in the circumstances, we need economic prosperity. Afghanistan's current economy is just $6 billion. People spoke a lot about that Afghanistan is right now showered with dollars in the last 20 years, and employment is rampant and everything is going dandy. We couldn't realize that most of the employment was of cooks, of drivers, of interpreters, who were associated with all those agencies and people who were there from America. So the moment Americans, majority of the forces and people, they went back, all of these people, they went unemployed. The point that I'm trying to say here is that in the last 19 years, and of course, if I go at large, in the last 40 years, nobody worked for indigenous economy of Afghanistan. It was all superficial. Soviet Union came, and with the departure of them, everything was orphan in Afghanistan, and so is the case at the moment with United States. So what I'm saying is that weak economies are exposed to instability. However, Chinese have a wonderful model. They say that, they have a wonderful economic model. They say that we cannot develop in a region where rest of our neighboring countries are economically backward. So they say that, in fact, it is the region that goes up rather than just one country which may be developed. They say if that model is applied anywhere, that one country which was booming definitely collapses. They are going for permanent solution of the problem. They are going for making China really an economic great power of the world on permanent grounds. So in the circumstances, on 1st June last year, it was the president of China who expressed his desire for stability in Afghanistan through BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. Now, Belt and Road Initiative's CPEC project is there, which is very close to Afghanistan, and therefore BRI here in terms of the process means CPEC. Currently, Afghanistan is heavily dependent on foreign aid, and poverty is widespread. as I mentioned, that indigenous economy is very weak and it was not focused. Another very important point that I want to make here is that economic prosperity is a prerequisite of national security. We want national security in the country. We want to bring an end to the civil war in Afghanistan. Economic prosperity is very important. Looking at the issue from security lens only and not economic, and not from economic perspective, will lash back. Until now, we have seen that all want to give foreign aid to Afghanistan, but none have invested in the development of its indigenous economy. Belt and Road framework will work for long-lasting solution to the problem, as I just stated. And this theory then will work that not countries but regions develop economically. Once again, we have a very beautiful example of the both groups that I just mentioned in the beginning. That is one ASEAN and the other is European Union. We say that in international economics that poverty anywhere is a threat to prosperity everywhere. And therefore, prosperity anywhere must be shared everywhere. This is just a quotation in international economics. And that is very aptly stated, I believe, and it suits with respect to what is happening in Afghanistan. What does it want, and what we can do as a neighboring country for this country. China has a policy not only to develop itself, but also the entire region as a whole, as I said before. And during 2019, Chinese ambassador to Afghanistan, his name is Li Jin-song, and he said that Afghanistan is the linchpin for the BRI. And he also stated that CPEC is a long open for Afghanistan. Afghanistan at the heart of the Silk Road, as it was in the past, so it is at the heart of the BRI project at the same time. How it will get connected, at the moment, because I'm just giving up. I'm not giving a multimedia presentation, so I'm unable to show you that map. But basically, via Wakhan, both countries' connection via Pakistan from Tajikistan. So Wakhan will be a beautiful connection for China and Afghanistan, and Pakistan's connection through Pakistan, if it is entering in Tajikistan. This means that the entire Central Asia will be open for China. So that would be a wonderful place where this connectivity, that is the title of today's webinar, will take place. Therefore, Afghans will benefit via both routes in case of Pakistan. That is Western route, which is right behind me where I am sitting at the moment, Peshawar, Torkham and Jalalabad. It is called the Western route, and the Southeastern route, that is Chaman and Kandahar. So through both routes, Afghanistan will take benefit. Let me say this thing once again, that CPEC will ensure economic growth for Afghanistan. Number two, it will reduce dependency on foreign aid, because foreign aid is something that is for the time being, and this is a lollipop that Afghanistan is having, and therefore it is failing to develop its own economy. Number three, very important thing is this CPEC will develop its indigenous economy that we are trying for at the moment for the peace and prosperity of Afghanistan. And number four, very important thing from CPEC for Afghanistan is connectivity via Gwadar to further Indian Ocean and beyond. So Afghanistan being a landlocked state, if it is given connectivity through Gwadar, it will not only be linked to the world, but also via Indian Ocean, it will go beyond. My audience, ladies and gentlemen, let me say this thing that Afghanistan's Minister of Mines and Petroleum, and therein later on entire ministry, claimed that $3 trillion of estimated mineral wealth is deposited in Afghanistan. if it is accepted that $3 trillion of mineral wealth is deposited in Afghanistan, of course it has to be exploited, one, and then it has to be exported to the entire world. Therefore, I say that such untapped resources will muster a lot of foreign investment. There would be a lot of employment for Afghanistan, and that will make Afghanistan a very important part of regional trading hub that I am speaking about since I started talking over the subject. I believe Afghanistan, once is on board with CPEC for an investment and exploitation of all these natural resources, of course, it will muster more and more employment in the country. Afghanistan will become part and parcel of an economic hub that we are anticipating in future vis-a-vis CPEC. Ladies and gentlemen, and then I say that if any country in the region can ever assist Afghanistan on permanent basis, I think it's only and only through economics. It's only and only through supporting Afghan economy, which is very weak at the moment. I just mentioned that it is $6 billion. You know well that only for maintenance of Afghan National Army and Afghan National Police, they are in need of $8 billion per year. Afghan economy is unable even to sustain it. So therefore, and I say that CPEC will assist it in developing its own economy, therefore making it a country. CPEC will make it a country that will not only be conducive for stopping terrorism, conducive for stopping all those spoilers who are working and operating in Afghanistan at the moment, but will also contribute for peace and prosperity, not only in Afghanistan, but for the entire region. I thank you very much for your attention. I stop here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soherwordi, for your remarks. Let's move across the Atlantic now. I would like to call Dr. Marvin Weinbaum. Apologies. You, sir, you have the floor now.
Thank you. So much of the attention right now is being placed on what's going on in Doha and the implications for not just Afghanistan, but for more broadly, peace in the region. I think, though, that it's important with this discussion that we see security and prosperity in Afghanistan in a broader, more far-reaching way, which is not specifically so focused on peace negotiations. Recognizing that the extent of security and prosperity in the region really rests on regional interdependence, that is, on connectivity among the countries in the region, whoever is in control, whatever the regime is in Afghanistan. No two countries, I believe, are more important to for Afghanistan in this respect than Pakistan and China. Pakistan has been so for decades, China more recently. Now, what I don't want to suggest is that in any way that the region, and I'm focusing here on peace, obviously, in Afghanistan, that the region can bring together the combating actors in Afghanistan. There are people who argue that with the United States disengaging from the region, that the region can now step in and secure Afghanistan, that it can bring the, as I say, the various parties together. I think that this is that this is not going to bring about a political solution, but the region is important in sustaining any kind of agreement that may be reached. That is, it cannot be an important factor here in bringing the parties together, but it can be important in sustaining whatever agreement is reached. what we know about the region is that it has its spoilers. It has in the past, and it does too as well. But that it's impossible, and I think this is true in what has already been said, it's impossible to imagine Afghanistan and having a viable economy without the interaction among players in the region. Afghanistan's future is in the region, and it is together cooperatively with the other countries in the region. These countries do have a stake, above all, in stability in Afghanistan. But what I'm arguing here is at the moment, the region is not yet a regional community. As we know, this region is among, if not the most, the least integrated economic system on the globe. The last figures I saw said that 5% of the illicit global trade takes place in this region. Now, of course, I'm leaving out here the illicit global trade because in this area, well, if we're talking about trafficking in narcotics, the region is very well integrated. The trouble in getting the region to realize its full potential as this least connected part of the globe, of course, is dependent upon the cooperation among these countries in positive engagement. And that means addressing the fact that there are regional rivalries, which have not been overcome. That still remains, and obviously the most important here is to take into consideration India's possible contribution here and how this is affected by longstanding, of course, enmity between India and Pakistan. It's going to be this kind of integration which is now impeding economic and structural reforms necessary to increase trade, facilitate investment, and promote energy transfers and also cultural exchanges. What we are looking for here, above all, is breaking down tariff and non-tariff barriers. We often hear that Afghanistan is landlocked. Afghanistan is a crossroads for trade and energy transfers connecting South and Central Asia. We must consider whether it is going to be more than that. And I think the other speakers have addressed how that might happen. But at the moment, it is very possible that Afghanistan will be merely collecting transit fees. Whatever happens here has to be something which is more than exploiting Afghanistan, particularly its natural resources. And the kind of integration that we're talking about cannot proceed without enormous investment here in roads and particularly in rail, of which there is virtually none in Afghanistan. We have only to look at TAPI for the difficulties in trying to have the nations work together, even when there is the best of will. Here, the various impediments that have come into play with TAPI and the fact that even with the financial investment in place, it does not seem to be able to making progress. Now, there has been changes in recent years, and I think this is very positive. There is a recognition now in the region here that of the importance of Afghanistan in the future, in their future of the regional countries. And there is also a developing here a definition about what has to be done. We've seen the emergence in recent years of organizations like RICA, SCO, Heart of Asia, all of which are Afghanistan-centered, and recognition that their own plans are so contingent upon stability and a united and stable Afghanistan, peaceful Afghanistan. And then, of course, there are the older organizations like ECO and SARC, which also have, I think, taken greater note of the fact of the importance of Afghanistan. Now, with so much, though, focused on this, again, I come back to the fact that the attention here has been so much on a peace agreement. Because this is, if Afghanistan is the linchpin for so much of this, we're all agreed that a Afghanistan at war pretty much negates most of what we're hopeful about Afghanistan and the region progress. We have to ask ourselves in this context, for example, were the Taliban to emerge as a political force, as a major political force in Afghanistan, and even were they to monopolize power, what would be the implications of what we're talking about here today? In what way would this have effect on these plans? Certainly the Taliban regime would want to have international assistance. It would want to see regional trade, international trade, but can such a regime satisfy investors? Can it play by international rules? Can it meet the financial requirements that would be necessary without it finding that these violated their own religious mandates? Now, where does China fit into the picture here? I don't believe that China is the key, as some do, key to making all of the problems go away by any means. I think that China, however, has a very consequential role, as we've been discussing. It has changed until fairly recently. China avoided getting involved in the political dynamics of any countries. But what is happening now, and we have to see it in this context, as the United States steps out, China is being drawn in to assure that there is some kind of framework which can bring stability. Until now, the United States, in its own way, has been holding the lid on Afghanistan, and I think has, in that role, been the stabilizer. But that's going to change. China's BRI could represent a new and different opportunity for connectivity, where Afghanistan is the integral part of a natural extension, of course, of CPEC. It offers a way to override or bypass many of the existing structural impediments and help override, yes, even national differences. There are, in addition to all of that has been said here, although certainly with the idea of building industrial capacity and creating employment opportunities, there are collateral advantages here which could even expand to transfer of administrative and technical skills and human resource development. On a different plane, I think that the possibility of better relations between Afghanistan and Pakistan would improve, of course, were they more thoroughly economically integrated, as is promised by a successful CPEC extension. BRI could provide dividends for Afghanistan But there is a problem here, given what we know about Afghanistan, that it could also provide an opportunity for spoils and internal conflict. There's reason, I think, to ask how much can be accomplished in Afghanistan given the current level of corruption and nepotism and a limited administrative capacity. Also a poorly equipped workforce. How much is possible without reconciliation among Afghanistan's political and economic elites? Afghanistan is one of those areas where the US and China certainly have overlapping interests. Of course, cooperation, I think, is out of the question at the moment. It is more a matter of, in this case, not interfering. And it has already been made reference to this. It's unfortunate that what we're talking about now has gotten caught up in this tensions, rising tensions between the United States and China. I think I saw at the very beginning that there was here in Washington a feeling that CPEC, in that it could produce stronger economies in Afghanistan and Pakistan and generally across the region, was one way to address the problem of international terrorism, which thrives in more destabilized environment. Unfortunately, I think that under the current administration here in Washington, that has been superseded by being used, I believe, as an instrument of American foreign policy in this competition with China. And I think some very unfortunate things have been said here in Washington in that regard. I think that among the, in addition to wanting to see a stable area, both China and the United States, and for that matter, all the countries in the region, would not like to see a monopolization of power by the Taliban. So I think that for the moment, the prospects, as long as Afghanistan is in the state it's in right now, that for a CPEC connection, and I think it's so clear, as much can be found so valuable in this relationship. At the moment, it's on hold. It's on hold, and but that's okay too, because I believe that for Afghanistan particularly, having as an aspiration here, it's taking its place in the regional community is something to inspire hope where there has been so little hope in the country. And in concluding, let me remark that I think we have to face the possibility, already given what we have seen in, as they're meeting right today in Doha, we have seen over the last 2 years in negotiations, that not only will this process be difficult, it is very possible it will break down. And we have to, all the countries in the region have to then, I think, address the fact of what then to do. How then can all of the various opportunities, plans that we have seen, what can happen, particularly if it turns out that Afghanistan, and this is certainly very possible, dissolves into a chaotic civil war. What I'm getting at here is that it may very well be that the neighbors, the international community more generally, deciding how important Afghanistan is to their security, will have to, at that point, decide to put its money on what is still a modern-looking regime in the Islamic Republic, and ask then how they can use whatever is at their capacity to make sure that this regime can survive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weinbaum, for your remarks. I would like to now invite Dr. Mir Wais Yasini to take the floor, please.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much for having me on this very valuable and informing webinar. And my best to all of you distinguished guests. So far, I've learned a lot from the previous three speeches. It's very much important for me individually and as well as for Afghanistan and for its future. I would like to begin that Madam Janjua very precisely said that we have a very deep precedent and due course of history of the Silk Route. So it is not something which is a new phenomenon to this region. And followed by the trip of Ibn Battuta via Afghanistan to China, it's another precedent of the connectivity and the importance of the connectivity to the world, to the region, and particularly to this area. Number two, I would like to come to Doha talks. We cannot afford the failure. The failure will be the world failure. The failure of the Doha talks will be the failure for security, the failure for economic prosperity, and the failure for the world order. Is it shown in the 90s, in just right after 90s, in before 90s, Afghanistan, God forbid, can become a very alarming source of terrorism, which it was in the past 20 plus years. First of all, we do need a viable, responsible government in Afghanistan. By that I mean it has to be inclusive. Taliban has to be there, democratic forces has to be there, all ethnic groups has to be there, and this shouldn't be a replica of the Bonn conference, like Taliban was left out, and the world in we Afghan couldn't control it. So that has to be inclusive. So far, when I'm looking to its current form, it is inclusive to certain degree, if not at all, not fully. Number one. Number two, prosperity does goes parallel with the security. As a common person, a lay person can know that. If there is no security, there is no prosperity. In our 40 years of history from 78, when the communist coup happened, the Khalq and Percham, we came from very poor classes of the society, and that was the reason, economy was one of the reasons that they switched their sides to the communism, socialism, by their definition. And that reason, in the coup of 1978, after the withdrawal of the Soviet Union, no incentive was offered to the Mujahideen, and no job was available for them, no shelter was available for them, no economics activity was available for them, and that resulted in the intra-Afghan parties fighting in the demolition and destruction of the hundreds or thousands of houses in Kabul, in the killing of 70,000 people. Same do in the Bonn camps, Taliban was left up, no incentive was offered to them. Coming to the point, Afghanistan is a landlocked country, which is very wisely said, and it does need the connectivity. And if there's a cash economy in Afghanistan, by that I mean we generate the cash sooner than later will be the connectivity. Of course, we have minerals. Of course, we have agriculture products. Of course, we have water, but that will take so long and so much budget and who is going to invest in that. So the speedy source of income for an ordinary Afghan, and beside that to the Afghan government, will be the connectivity. That can be energy transfer from Central Asia to the South Asia and beyond its border of the South Asia and Central Asia, number one. Number two, I would like to offer that BRI or the CPEC to be maybe on the 3 paths. Number one is Gwadar to Kandahar, Kandahar to Herat, and then to Turkmenistan. And another one is to Peshawar, Kabul, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and up to Kyrgyzstan. And if you go further down to Azerbaijan, to Turkey, to connect Asia with Europe. The third one will be the Wakhan corridor, which is very important. The shortest way will be that, but that will take some time. So from an Afghan perspective, I do see very much need for the CPEC and this connectivity, and that will be one of the reasons that Afghanistan can stand on its feet. If it doesn't happen, beside, and it is the terrorist negative impact on the world, there'll be economic refuge in millions from the region to one point, from one point to other point. That if that connectivity is created, then that problem will be solved, or that the largest, or the millions, I will put it in this way, millions refuge can be prevented. Honestly, the United States helped us a lot for the past 20 years economically, but we do not have income generating indigenous project in support here. So we do not have anything. If they went out, if the 4 or 5 billion budget is cut automatically, what we'll be doing with our forces, with our security sectors here, with our judicial system here. But we do need a solid and responsible system in Kabul, a responsible system in Kabul for that to happen. We also, in addition of that, Afghanistan have, as one of our friends here, Dr. Soherwordi said, it does have a lot of minerals. Well, if you do not speak for the time being for the precious mineral like lithium, nubium, cobalt, uranium, we have plenty of semi-precious minerals like iron, copper, zinc, lead, coal, talcs, and I don't know any valley in Afghanistan which does not have one of or 2 or 3 of those elements. We just need the connectivity to export it to Pakistan, to export it to China, to export it to the Indian Ocean, to export it backward to the Central Asia and beyond its border. So that is very, very important. Security must restore. Doha talks has to be successful. Responsible government has to be found in Afghanistan and installed in Afghanistan or created in Afghanistan. And then it has to go parallel security and economy. In the economy, the only one way to support the Afghan indigenous economy will be the connectivity, and that is very, very important. I totally agree with the distinguished speakers, and my privilege again to be part of this very productive webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your remarks. I will now like to call Mr. Michael Kugelman to take the floor.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I wanted to first thank IPRI. Really appreciate the opportunity to be participating in what's a very timely event with a very distinguished panel. Sharing and congrats as well to my friend Hussain for his new post. at IPRI. I guess the advantage of being the final speaker is that all that's had to be said has already been said. So my job is easy, theoretically. But I'll try to fill in some gaps, perhaps, and also underscore some of the important points already made. And I'll start with a brief general reflection. I think that this has sort of been implied already, but I think that at this point, we may be putting the cart before the horse just a bit. There's a whole lot that needs to happen before we can talk seriously about the prospect of CPEC or BRI expanding into Afghanistan. Several things specifically must be in place, which I'll very briefly list in what I see as ascending order of difficulty. First, there will need to be buy-in from the Taliban. The interesting thing is that the Taliban has signed off, has issued its approval, so to speak, on several major infrastructure projects in Afghanistan, including TAPI. It has said that it supports the TAPI project as a key component of Afghan economic infrastructure. Now, if the Taliban supports TAPI, one would think that it could come around to support BRI or CPEC, which is not an Afghan government project enterprise per se, but rather projects of the Chinese and Pakistani governments, which have never really been enemies of the Taliban, far from it. Second, and more challenging, is that in order to have BRI and CPEC really take shape in Afghanistan, you would need to have more trust between Pakistan and Afghanistan. We all know this is a very complex relationship that has its good moments and its more difficult moments. And to their credit, I think it's quite clear that both Kabul and Islamabad have sought in recent years to strengthen the relationship. And I think that the recent appointment of a Pakistani special envoy to Kabul, the very respected Ambassador Sadiq, I think that's a very good sign. Special envoy for reconciliation in Afghanistan. It's a very good sign, a very respected figure in Afghanistan in that post. But clearly there still is a lot of deeply embedded mistrust, much of it attributable to lingering resentment about things like cross-border terrorism and a long-standing border dispute. Third, most importantly and most difficult to achieve, is that in order to be talking seriously about CPEC, BRI expanding into Afghanistan, you will likely need a peace deal in Afghanistan, or at least enough stability to talk seriously about major Chinese infrastructural development there. China, as I understand it, has really put on hold most of its investment plans in Afghanistan, BRI related or other, due to the war. Beijing is not afraid to navigate difficult security environments in its infrastructure investments abroad. We see this in a variety of contexts, including through its investments in infrastructure in parts of Africa and Southeast Asia. But there's only so much that it can do in a war zone. And we all know the challenges of the fledgling peace process. These have already been described. And even if there is a peace deal, there would be lingering terror threats from the various other militant organizations in Afghanistan, like Daesh, like Islamic State, that would not be party to a peace process and have no fondness for the Chinese or Pakistani or Afghan governments, for that matter, and any projects that they undertake together. But at any rate, that's just a digression, as I've been asked to speak on the impact of BRI and CPEC on the US-Afghan strategy. And I would argue that there is not all that much of an impact on US-Afghan strategy. I think there is a misconception among some observers, including some in Pakistan, but also elsewhere, a misconception that the US is present, has been present, and is present in Afghanistan to push back against China, or even to contain China. And by extension, the US is present in Afghanistan to push back against a potential CPEC or BRI expansion into Afghanistan. And that really is not true from a US policy perspective. The US is not in Afghanistan to push back against China. It is there to push back against terrorists. And that's because, at least now, it tends to look at Afghanistan mainly through a counterterrorism lens. Now, it is certainly true, as I believe has already been noted, that US-China policy, broadly speaking, is very much focused on pushing back against China. That's the essence of the US Indo-Pacific strategy, even if US officials don't state that explicitly when describing the strategy, but the US Indo-Pacific strategy is all about trying to counterbalance China in that region. The US government in recent months has started to articulate public and fervent public opposition to CPEC. We all remember the famous, though I imagine many in Pakistan would remember it as an infamous speech that Ambassador Alice Wells made at the Wilson Center, where I work, last November, when she delivered a scathing critique of CPEC. And this marked an evolution in US policy, as up until Ambassador Wells made that speech, US criticism of CPEC had been relatively muted publicly. There had not been any type of official public rejection or even criticism of CPEC. Certainly there was private concerns on the part of US government officials, but until we had that speech from Ambassador Wells, it had not really been articulated publicly, and certainly not as strongly as she worded her criticism. The reason for the change is, of course, a worsening US-China rivalry. CPEC and Pakistan have sadly got caught up in this worsening US-China rivalry. Ambassador Wells' speech was not meant to be critical of Pakistan, far from it. And the second part of her speech, which is not remembered or cited nearly as much as the first part when she criticizes CPEC, the second part of that speech called for stepped up US investment in Pakistan. The speech was really meant to be critical of the Chinese government and specifically its investment models as reflected in CPEC and BRI more broadly. So yes, the US government is indeed intent on pushing back against China, and this is a bipartisan objective. So if you get a President Joe Biden in the White House in January, his administration may not resort to the witheringly sharp rhetoric against China that you hear from the Trump administration, but we can safely assume that even a Biden administration would look at China as a strategic competitor and threat in the same way that the Trump administration has. But the thing is that US policy is focused on pushing back against China only in places where China is present and has a considerable footprint. And it really does not have a deep footprint in Afghanistan. It's not very present there relative to where it is elsewhere, so to speak. The war makes it very hard to develop a deeper footprint in Afghanistan. So to be candid, the US-Afghanistan strategy is not impacted by or guided by or informed by CPEC or BRI. It is informed by other things like terrorism and pursuing peace talks and ultimately planning for its exit from Afghanistan. So perhaps the better question to ask is the reverse of the one posed initially. And that would be, what is the impact of US-Afghan strategy on CPEC and BRI? But that first requires a brief examination of the US-Afghan strategy itself. What is this strategy? I'd actually argue that since the very first few weeks of the US-led war in Afghanistan, when US forces achieved their core initial goals of knocking out the al-Qaeda sanctuaries and removing the Taliban from power, ever since those initial goals were achieved early on in the war, there has not been a terribly coherent US-Afghan strategy. There really hasn't been a very well-articulated strategy at all. And this is one of the main reasons why the US mission in Afghanistan has struggled so much. The question of, why are we there? What are we fighting for? These are questions that have not really been adequately answered, pardon me, for nearly 2 decades. But what the strategy basically revolves around right now, today, are 3 goals. Working with Kabul, Islamabad, the Taliban, and other players to help facilitate an Afghan peace process that ends the war. Preparing for a smooth withdrawal of military forces. And figuring out how to maintain some type of a counterterrorism capacity in Afghanistan. And I should say that this is a bipartisan strategy. This is what we should expect to see in the coming months, regardless of whether Trump stays in the White House or is replaced by Biden. I would argue that US strategy in Afghanistan is pretty consistent and will largely remain the same regardless of who wins the election in November. Now these US goals, if achieved, and that's a big if, can potentially deliver major boosts to the Belt and Road Initiative. And that's because if you get a Taliban peace deal and reduce terror, well, that bodes well for China's ability to start building out BRI. So ironically, current US-Afghan strategy could give a considerable fillip to America's top strategic rival. It could give China more stable space to operate in, and in due course to expand its Belt and Road Initiative, a project that the US is trying to push back against futilely through the Indo-Pacific strategy and related measures. Another question that I think is worth asking here is, what does the future, or what does a future US-Afghan strategy mean for CPEC and BRI? It's hard to answer this question. That's because we don't know what that strategy will look like. It's hard enough to articulate what the current strategy is, but trying to think about a future US strategy in Afghanistan, that's even tougher. But let's just game this out a bit. If the US draws down its military presence nearly to zero by the spring of next year, per the terms of the US-Taliban agreement, and there is not a peace deal in place by that time, and if the war continues, then I doubt we would see much forward movement on a CPEC expansion, as the security situation would make it very difficult. And even if the US military withdrawal is slowed down amid the Taliban's failure to uphold its commitments in the deal that it made with the US, and if the peace process is not successful, then I doubt there would be much forward movement with CPEC expansion. That said, even with Afghanistan still at war, there can be opportunities to lay the foundation stones for CPEC and BRI in Afghanistan when the country is more stable or at peace. So for example, scaled up trade between Afghanistan and Pakistan would be a major step forward, a confidence building measure that could lead to better bilateral relations and also a means of building momentum for deeper economic cooperation, including infrastructure. Now, if the US military withdrawal takes place and there is a peace deal, or even some type of ceasefire or violence reduction plan, then that could enable space for an expansion of CPEC into Afghanistan. This is not something that would be a good thing for cold, hard US interests, given that US policy, at least for now, tends to take a zero-sum view of its deepening rivalry with China. And it would not want China to be stepping up its role in Afghanistan. What would make matters worse for US policy is that other states, other countries that are both regional actors and US rivals would be poised to step up their own roles to contribute to or build out infrastructure projects, countries like Russia and Iran. Now, in an ideal world, that would actually be a major opportunity for the US, for Pakistan, for China, for Afghanistan, and the whole region. If US troops leave Afghanistan and there is some semblance of peace in Afghanistan, Washington would have the opportunity to operationalize a long aspirational government vision for a new US-led effort to make Afghanistan and Central Asia more integrated and more prosperous. And this is an initiative known as the New Silk Road Initiative. It's been articulated by a number of US government officials in recent years, but nothing has really been done about it to operationalize it. But if there's actual forward movement, this could entail ramping up efforts to complete the TAPI project, CASA 1000, and other US-backed infrastructure projects, and also to link them up with BRI projects in Afghanistan and the broader region. And at the end of the day, these are the types of outcomes that the US supports in Afghanistan and the broader region: more connectivity, more trade, more prosperity, and more stability. Now, I say this is an ideal scenario because it is also highly unlikely, at least in the immediate term. This would require peace in Afghanistan. It would require the US and China to set aside their bitter rivalry in order to work together on shared goals of infrastructure development. Given the strength and the intensity and the toxicity of the US-China rivalry, one that will remain in place no matter who wins the US election, I think we need to keep our expectations low about there potentially being cooperation between the US and China in Afghanistan. Ultimately, Washington's ability to implement its longstanding vision of more connectivity and prosperity and trade in Afghanistan and Central Asia, as articulated in its New Silk Road Initiative, this will depend on two key factors: a capacity to field some type of on-the-ground civilian presence in the absence of a security umbrella previously provided by US troops, and secondly, successful US diplomatic efforts that improve relations with its bitter rivals. And it's an important point that, you know, it so happens that some of America's most bitter rivals are in the region where Afghanistan is, China, Russia, Iran. Both of these outcomes that I lay out here are fairly unlikely. I think the most likely outcome of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, and I'll conclude here, the most likely outcome of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, if there is a peace deal, is that it will essentially cede ample ground to its top rivals in Afghanistan, China, but also Russia and Iran. This means that Washington could find itself locked out of the very regional cooperation that it very much wants to see take shape in Afghanistan. And as I said before, this should not necessarily be seen as a bad thing for US interest, given that these countries, through shared infrastructure development, could create the very outcomes supported by the US. But the fact that the countries involved would happen to be the US's most bitter rivals would make it difficult for US officials to say that their interests are being served, as its top rivals would be embedding their influence in a strategic space, in a strategic region, where the US would no longer be present, or at least not at the levels that it has been up to now. So thank you very much, and I look forward to discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Kugelman, for your remarks. I would now like to open up the question and answer session. To begin with, I will request Ambassador Asif Durrani to please ask the question. Sir, the floor is yours. If you could please table that before. Ambassador Durrani, are you there? I'll ask the question on Ambassador Durrani's behalf. He has actually submitted it. This question is panel before Professor Weinbaum and Michael Kugelman. He asked, US has been opposed to CPEC and the BRI. Do you think that US would be comfortable if Afghanistan joins CPEC and BRI?
Michael, why don't you address that?
Sure, I could start. Yeah, I mean, just to reiterate some of what I just said, I think that from a strictly economic lens, there's no reason why the US should be opposed to Afghanistan joining this huge Chinese super project, just because the intended outcomes of CPEC are those that reflect US interests, you know, more connectivity, more trade, more prosperity, more stability, and all that. But you know, the force of the US-China rivalry makes it difficult, I think, for any US government to be willing to openly, publicly support a project like CPEC. Now, if Afghanistan joins CPEC, the US is not going to necessarily come out and publicly say, no, Afghanistan should not do that. And especially given that the US is, for all intents and purposes, on its way out of Afghanistan, and we don't know what type of leverage and footprint and all that it will have in the coming months. That's still to be worked out, but militarily it's on its way out. And it'll be very difficult, I think, to maintain a significant footprint once you lose that security presence and that security umbrella. So the US doesn't really have much leverage, and it really is not in a position to say what Afghanistan should or should not do. But I think that the strategic calculus here is critical, just that we're in this for the long haul. This US-China rivalry is not going to go away anytime soon. And I think the US government will continue to try to counterbalance China's growing influence, and BRI is one of the main vehicles for that influence, by using tools like the Indo-Pacific strategy and things like that to try to push back. But at the end of the day, the US government would have to agree, any US government would have to agree that any project that gives Afghanistan an opportunity to achieve the types of outcomes that the US wants it to achieve, more infrastructure, more connectivity, all that, at the end of the day, it's hard to oppose that, even if the US government would not say that publicly.
Yeah, Michael, I agree entirely. I would also mention, though, that if the promise of what the CPEC, Afghanistan involvement in CPEC really looks to be real, then whatever the United States has to say, these countries will go ahead very much so on their own to pursue what they think is in their own national interests. You know, we tend to overemphasize the kind of leverage that the United States has. I think that there are red lines, and I believe that the kind of opportunities that may be available here are such that even if the United States finds disagreement, that countries in the region are going to go ahead again, regardless of that. I would also mention that at least we should keep in mind that once the United States military forces are gone, what interest there is in the United States in Afghanistan is going to diminish as well. And even now, Afghanistan is not a major item on the agenda, political agenda, certainly, of here in the United States. And so much of our attention here has been on the fact that we have had boots on the ground in Afghanistan. So I think that as far as the Afghans are concerned, they're very proud people. And I think there are limits here that when they recognize that they've got something to their interest, their opportunity here, whether it is commensurate with what the United States is doing or not, their opportunity here to develop partnerships with others in the region will supersede any kind of obligations to the United States, particularly the United States that has, in their eyes, for many at least, walked away from Afghanistan.
Sorry, apologies. Can you all hear me now? We're moving on to our next question, and I think Syed Muhammad Ali would like to ask that. Sir, over to you. Sir, you would have to unmute your mic. I've sent you a request.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, lovely. My question is aimed at my old friend, Marvin Weinbaum. Good to hear from you, Marvin. Good to see you still active and young and contributing towards Afghanistan. My question is that it has basically two parts. One is, do you expect some modification in the US approach towards Afghanistan in case Democrats come to power? And secondly, do you expect some sort of realization in the US that beyond the security lens, Afghanistan should be seen from perhaps an economic lens, which should also offer the new dispensation that includes Afghan Taliban and Kabul administration and economic leverage, which provides an incentive for them to work towards a profitable peace rather than just looking at it from the security lens. I'm referring to a possibility of perhaps US leading in collaboration with other major powers, offering a sort of a 3 to 4 year long development agenda for Afghanistan, which provides a commitment, a multilateral commitment to peace and economic progress for the Afghanistan that will also disincentivize further violence in future. Hello? Yeah, did you hear me?
Okay, can you hear me now? Yes.
Yeah.
As Michael has already said, I don't think we should expect any major changes at all. There might be something to be said for the fact that nominee Biden has in the past, some 10 years ago, suggested the United States ought to get its forces out and have a campaign offshore, as he put it. And that was the idea that the United States would continue to follow a counterterrorism strategy, but would do so mainly with air power and with the provision here of intelligence. There are problems with this, and this was not the course taken when the surge then was put into place. But there's every reason to believe, as I suggested before, that the United States investment psychologically, as well as every other way, in Afghanistan is going to be reduced. And so I don't believe we can expect, what we can expect is a regime in the United States which values international cooperation more. We're less likely to get the current administration's kind of saying, well, we're for engagement with others as long as they agree with us. So I again think that we're not going to look at a big change. As far as investment, as you say, well, it's interesting that Secretary of State Pompeo did say recently, and he held this off as a kind of incentive, that the United States was prepared to invest in Afghanistan once they were able to reach an agreement. That's obviously predicated on the fact that they can, because although we tend to focus on the fact that the differences between the Taliban and the Afghan government are essentially over the form of government, in that is embedded the notion about what kind of economy as well. There are strict restrictions on what a strictly Sharia government would be prepared to do. Now, you could say that those will all fall by the wayside once they have to face the reality of being the kind of country they were in the 1990s, where effectively there was no economy. But I think we're constantly also at the same time reminded of what degree the Taliban, to what extent the Taliban are willing to accept hardship in order to also be able to say we're living up to our principles. Simply then, this is certainly a possibility, but the United States will at that point have no real interest in there except this counterterrorism interest. And if it can be related to that in some way, that perhaps the United States would make also the economic investment. Let's keep in mind that as the United States withdraws forces, it still has development investment in Afghanistan. That undoubtedly will be reduced now. It's hard to imagine the Congress is going to continue the same level of economic support once the U.S. forces have departed. So your point is well taken, but I would not put much stock on the United States stepping in. There are others who would. There are others who will be very willing to step in. And the real question in my mind is, will the wealthier Arab states take a part here? Because that could create certain directions for the economy as well as political policies.
Thank you so much. We'll move on to the next question. Ms. Tehmina Janjua, this question is for you. It's been asked by a student, Mr. Rasul, and he asks, will the inclusion of Afghanistan permit and give open access to India, access to Afghanistan and the Central Asian states? Ma'am, you need to unmute, please.
Unmute. Done. Well, I think we need to, obviously I expected this question to come up, but the fact is that when we are talking about regional connectivity, we are looking at something which has possibilities right now in the context of Afghanistan, despite the fact that we are undergoing a peace process. Pakistan has always wanted to have trade relations with India. So does India has had trade relations with Pakistan. But considering the type of situation that's existing in India right now, where one of its major provinces or states, former states, is now under where the Kashmiris are under immense crackdown, and where there is no notion of human rights whatsoever, where the worst human rights situation, in fact, humanitarian situation prevails. How can Pakistan even think of having any kind of opening up right now? It can happen in the future, but right now, there is little possibility of that happening. There's no rationality prevailing in India right now as far as its leadership is concerned. Look at the laws that they've adopted with regard to minorities in India. Look at what they are doing with the Muslims in India. Look at the way things are working out in India as far as the situation is concerned. Pakistan finds itself in a difficult situation considering the very inhuman policies that are being perpetuated against the minorities, against the people of Jammu and Kashmir especially, where you hear the most horrific situation prevailing. At this point, it is difficult for us to even consider the possibility of opening up trade or reinstating trade with India. There was a point in earlier on when President Ghani had said that they would be interested in CPEC if Pakistan opens up to the Wagah border for trade. Now, the fact remains that here Pakistan is trying very hard with China to have economic relations with Afghanistan, especially in a post negotiation process where we hope there will be peace. In any case, our sincerity is clearly outlined by the fact that we are now allowing the transit trade between for Afghanistan to go from Gwadar. And we had throughout, despite our some difficult times of relationship, we continue to allow in Afghanistan to ply our roads. The trucks used to ply our roads. As there was a reference made to Afghanistan being a landlocked country. Yes, it's been a country which has been in a very difficult situation, and that is the reason why we have worked very hard to see that the transit trade possibilities and the fact that the Wagah opens up, and the fact that we are building roads, we're trying to build roads from Peshawar to Kabul, to Kandahar, and from. So there are possibilities that are there which ensure that trade for the people of Afghanistan is in place, so that the problems they face as a landlocked country are diminished.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We'll move on to our next question. Mr. Yasini, this question is for you. It comes from a PhD scholar by the name of Nahida. And she asked that, she's asking how actively are women participating in the Afghanistan peace process and the decision-making processes of Afghanistan? Sir, you would need to unmute, please. Thank you. No, sir, still not unmuted. Just again, sir, please. I've sent you a request. If you could. There. Perfect, sir.
It's a very important question. We have 4 members from Kabul side within the Doha, and we have about 8 members in the Shura of Peace. They are very actively participated, and the women made a lot of progress for the past 19 years in Afghanistan. But the important thing is that how we can keep the space of the women participation in politics, in social life, in educational life. So that is very, very important. But still, I can assure you, there will be women participation immaterial what is happening. So we cannot rule out that. And nobody is that. And that is the integral part of the humanity. So that has to be there. And if we have some bad memories, just forget about that. And let's be optimistic about the human future, the women future in Afghanistan. And I hope, and inshallah, that will be there.
Wonderful. We are getting a lot of questions, so just going to try to squeeze in a bit more. Our next question is for you, Dr. Soherwordi. The question comes from Emil Khan, who asks, keeping in view that India is out of Chabahar, could Pakistan permit including India as part of CPEC via the Kandahar route and the Chaman route? Sir, we are unable to hear you. You are unmuted, so. It looks like we might be having difficulties. Oh, so I think in the meantime, he's going to turn it on again. So in the meantime, we can ask the next question. This goes to Mr. Kugelman. This is for you. It's asked by Mr. Mateen. He asks, how would US and actors react to Chinese extension of CPEC and Silk Road inclusion in Afghanistan?
I'm sorry, can you repose the question? You cut out for a second. Could you ask it again?
Yes, I can ask you that question again. However, I do believe that, this question has been asked before and it's been covered before. The question was, how would US and other international actors react to Chinese extension of CPEC and Silk Road? So,
yeah, you could go ahead with the previous question,
yeah,
because I think we've already addressed that.
Yes, we have. So, Mr. Soherwordi, I'm going to re-ask your question to you. That was, keeping in view that India is out of Chabahar, could Pakistan permit to include India as part of CPEC via the Kandahar and Chaman route? Well,
Am I audible now?
yes, you are audible, sir.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, well, this is something that is there. Once again, in security situation, people think like that, somehow we will lose importance or someone else will gain importance. As I mentioned, with respect to the policy and with respect to the philosophy of a regional development, a regional model for development, we need to have others on board so that we may catch the boons of economic prosperity. And for that matter, we need to cooperate and collaborate with other countries. If we are linking our Gwadar with the Chabahar, of course, it will have more and more economic trade between the countries. And so is the case with numerous other ports, and they are really cashing a lot. There is nothing that one Chabahar will influence a Gwadar or vice versa. Everybody will have one's own share. One thing. Second thing, this thing that if Afghanistan is on board, will we be granting the same line to India? Well, not in the case, not exactly that. But of course, this once CPEC is formed, once CPEC will grant its benefits to the member countries or to the countries that are involved in it. Of course, India will learn a lesson. They will realize that the economics is the future of this region, and it shouldn't compromise on especially in those areas where human rights are violated in the country. And that I'm talking about the Kashmir situation, that I'm talking about the domicile situation of Kashmiris, that I'm talking about Muslims' pathetic condition at the moment in India, in Afghanistan, in India. So I believe that in terms of the process, once economic projects are successful, many countries then they feel like to join them rather than moving away from there.
Great, thank you so much. Another question is one for all panelists. It comes from Hamza Uriksai. He asks, what projects, excluding roads and infrastructure, can Pakistan and China both introduce to Afghanistan that complement CPEC and be beneficial for both Afghanistan and Pakistan? So anyone can take this question? Yes, Ms. Janjua, please.
I think in the course of the discussions, as you know, as far as expansion of CPEC is concerned, there have been some preliminary discussions in this regard, and as I referred to in my statement, in the trilateral meetings between Afghanistan, Pakistan, and China, and there's a special segment that is dedicated to infrastructure development. The discussions that have gone on, of course, there has been, it's not very clear as to what projects would go on, and of course it will depend on what the Afghans would like to see. But the priority has to be given to what the Afghans would like themselves, and the agenda is set for themselves. The important thing that when the earlier discussions took place in the context of the trilateral dialogue, both China and Pakistan and Afghanistan had said that yes, they welcome this opportunity, but we should start off with small projects, i.e. maybe building hospitals, schools, or developing some kind of infrastructure which helps and directly goes and affects the people of Afghanistan in different regions of Afghanistan. So there are no mega projects that have been discussed. There is the possibility of taking it little by little and bringing it to a high level. And the Chinese foreign minister had spoken about taking CPEC through to Kabul and then connecting it with their northwest road link as well. But we should not minimize the importance of road links, because these provide wherever they go, and we've seen it in Pakistan, that wherever the CPEC projects go, the roads network goes, it brings prosperity to those areas where the roads go, and therefore you have development of it. We have started it. I wish General Bajwa was here, because they launched yesterday the industrialization project, which is going to be along the CPEC route as far as Pakistan is concerned. And those could be possibilities that can be looked at, because of course for the future, for prosperity to return, to ensure unemployment is reduced, to ensure that there are fewer people interested in the more violent aspects of living in a society, it is important that there should be infrastructure that is built, and along that infrastructure, roads, railways, along that infrastructure, there can be possibilities of developing special economic zones, of developing, which is what's happening in the case of Pakistan, and of course, help industrialization in Afghanistan, the areas that they are strong. Thank you.
Great. Now we will take a question from Dr. Syed. Dr. Syed asks, what would be the implications for Pakistan as it possibly goes through, what is the future of warm waters, rather, in light of the growing influence of China via BRI? This is for Dr. Soherwordi, but I don't think he's here at the moment. He might step out. So we can move on to the next question, or if any other of the panelists would like to answer that. The future of warm waters. Okay, I think we'll just move on to the next question. This is comes from Mr. Chandio, RF, agree. He asked that since everyone agrees, including the US itself, that Afghanistan needs money for every reason, why is the US standing opposed to the very idea of BRI? Anyone for Mr. Kugelman?
Well, I mean, I think going back to what's already been stated, I mean, US opposition to BRI is grounded in strategic considerations. You know, there's no way that a US government could come out and embrace something that represents the chief vehicle for spreading Chinese influence. So I think it's really as simple as that. And as I said in my remarks, I think that I can't speak for a Biden administration, but looking at what the Trump administration has done over the last few years, it looks at its rivalry with China through a zero-sum lens. And I think that doesn't offer enough flexibility to be more supportive of a project that, as I noted before, is intended potentially to have outcomes that the US supports. If this was a US partner that was doing this, that was running the BRI, it would be a whole other story. But we're looking at China. We're looking at you know, America's top strategic competitor, a country that the current government has regarded not just as a strategic competitor, but as a bona fide and significant national security threat. So I think that it all comes to that, and there's really no other way of looking at it, in my view. Now we'll see. You know, as was noted before, a Biden administration may be would not be so sharply critical. It would tone down the rhetoric when it comes to its messaging on China, and it would want to work more with international partners in its China policy. But I don't really think that the bottom line would change. I don't see any future U.S. government being any less inclined to be opposed for strategic reasons to the Belt and Road Initiative.
Great. I would now like to ask another question where I believe Mr. Ali Ansari wants to ask a question. Sir?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm actually not asking a question. I'm going to answer some comments. I just joined. I'm very sorry. I just got the message, and I think it's too late to continue. I think you're about to be done. However, I just want to answer in regard to the Arabs should invest in Afghanistan, and this question has been raised by some of the participants. So I could speak for Saudi Arabia. I think Saudi Arabia is very concerned about the stability, the unity of the Afghan people. We wish that we see a cohesive approach towards that stability. Once that stability is there and it's clear to everybody, any investor doesn't want to throw his money away. But we would love to be in Afghanistan. The business community would be happy to share with the Afghan people their products, and also to have a good trade between. But so far, the stability that's would comfort people to invest in a good environment in Afghanistan is very important for anybody. So what's required is the Afghan people should have a very constructive dialogue, and I think they are having one now, and hopefully it would result in a very positive, better approach towards stabilizing the whole country. The country is divided now. The government is, we are seeing so many incidents and unfortunate incidents in Afghanistan. Recently, we have seen an attempt to kill one of the senior people in the government. So, I don't think anybody, whether they are Saudis or Arabs or Chinese, they would run to the uncertainty of their investment anywhere in the world, not just in Afghanistan. So I think stability is absolutely vital at this current time. And I think, you know, not only the Arabs, but the Muslim countries would go and join commercially in Afghanistan. They need a good Ministry of Trade. They need a good Chamber of Commerce that would communicate with their counterpart in the Arab world. They need to present what the opportunities that are available in Afghanistan to attract investors. And I'm sure once the stability is there, everybody would be happy to go to Afghanistan and invest in their field.
Thank you for your comments, sir. I'm going to ask a couple of more questions and then we will wrap up. This question has been asked by Hamza. He asked, the US has often peddled the mantra of debt trap with regard to CPEC in Pakistan. Do you see it doing the same if Afghanistan is to join CPEC in the future? This question is open to all panelists. Would anyone like to answer?
Sorry about that.
Thank you.
I think that you know, this is consistent messaging from the Trump administration, but not only from the Trump administration. I think from other governments and also analysts, people that study economic issues and international political economy, indicate that China's broader investment model, whether it's deployed in BRI projects or beyond, is not equitable, is not healthy, and is arguably even predatory. I mean, this is a view that's widely held, not widely held, but it's a view that's held that goes beyond just what the U.S. thinks and what the U.S. government thinks. They're very real concerns, and the fact that there have been a number of countries that had been initial supporters of the Belt and Road Initiative and had been host countries like Malaysia, for example, have in recent months sort of indicated some concern about it, and we all know the stories and the critiques. So the question as to whether, you know, the U.S. would change its view about how China does these things if Afghanistan were to join, I don't necessarily think so. It's the same broader critique that that you hear from the U.S. and other places as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Perhaps we can squeeze in just, Mr. Janjua, you would like to say something, please.
On this debt trap issue, there's a lot that's been said in the United States and a lot that's been said in Pakistan as well. I'd just like to point out that the person who's asked the question on that with regard to that and Pakistan's position on it, there's a very clear statement that was made by the Minister of Planning in this regard, and I would recommend him to read it as far as Pakistan is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Perhaps we can squeeze in just one more question. I know you all have places to go, places to be, but the next question comes from Adila. She is a research associate, and she asks, this is for Mr. Mirwais Yasini. How do you assess the Indian role in sabotaging CPEC, especially in Afghanistan? Sir, please, yes.
Is the question to everyone, or is it? Oh, sorry. Sorry.
It's very early to predict or to say, but hopefully they will not jeopardize because of their rivalry with their next door neighbor, Pakistan. And if they're claiming they're their friend in Afghanistan, however, in some avenue, they played a very negative role. And hopefully they will not do that. Because as I said in our earlier webinar, as well as in the current webinar, that Afghans are independent country. Afghanistan is an independent country. This is an independent nation. We have to appoint our own benchmarks in our own national interest. And the CPEC goes very much deep into our national interest, and that gives us a lot of lucrative businesses in the businesses that we can live on it. So not even India, I will hope and I will expect that not anybody does interfere in our political and economic life in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Mr. Yasini. In keeping with the time, I believe that we should wrap up, but thank you all so much for your participation. I would also like to thank our distinguished panelists. Now, for the full closure, I would give it the floor to Brigadier Rashid Ali Janjua. Please, sir.
Thanks, Main, and it was really a pleasure having all the distinguished panelists. And this has been a very rewarding and a very engaging discussion. And I'm sure the lessons which we learned and the thoughts that we crystallized will go a long way in helping us sensitizing our policy practitioners. And some of the very important takeaways that we got from our Afghan panelists and our across the Atlantic panelists, and the presence of experienced diplomat like Tehmina, Janjua, it added a new dimension to the entire discourse. And the most important takeaway perhaps was the need for a sustained source of income generation in Afghanistan, which should take Afghanistan away from a trade aid dependency that has been the bane of the Afghanistan's development in the past. And a very important aside from Michael Kugelman was that perhaps the outcome which the United States brokered peace deal might result a sustained and lasting peace which is acceptable and which is with the consensus of all the stakeholders might lead to an outcome that might be, contrary to the United States' strategic interests. But what promises hope is a new century of hope and a new paradigm in which the geoeconomics in the region trumps the geopolitics, and a win-win formulation which is premised upon United States and China. They cooperate also, and a day might come when we might see CASA 1000 and TAPI linking up in a very symbiotic manner with the CPEC and BRI to result in a peace bonanza in the region. And I think that's the vision that the entire region and the world should look up to. So I once again thank all the distinguished panelists for a very engaging and a very comprehensive discussion. I thank you all.
Yes, Ms. Janjua.
I want to just thank and congratulate you, Mahin, for so effectively being the moderator for this session. You've been
You are too
excellent.
kind.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
As a woman, I'm proud of you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. This brings us to the close of the webinar. Thank you all for joining us, with a special thanks again to our distinguished panels. Take care. Office.